before we start the panel, I just want to mention that it's sort of the panel, that the discussion is kind of inspired by an article I wrote recently on the topic where I argued that 5G fixed wireless and low Earth orbit satellites are rendering many of our current broadband policies on competition and universal service outdated and even potentially counterproductive. And so while I believe that to be true, my point is not to argue that here. I want to be the unbiased moderator, impartial moderator, so feel free to call me out if I appear to not be doing that, even though I'm right, of course. But we will today explore how changes and advancements in technologies are challenging our traditional approaches to broadband competition, universal service, BEAD, and regulatory frameworks. And so we have a great panel to discuss it. Just quickly, I think actually they even sat in alphabetical order. Will Adams, the Vice President of Strategy, Policy, and Planning at T-Mobile. Johannes Bauer, who's the Quello Chair in Media and Information Policy at the College of Communications, Arts, and Sciences at Michigan State University and the current Chief Economist at the FCC. Michelle Connolly, Professor of Economics at Duke University. And Jay Schwarz, Vice President of Global Public Policy at ComcastNBC. So let's start with the big questions at the highest level. How have new technologies changed the broadband competitive landscape? Who wants to start? All right,
I can give it a crack. So it's good to be here. It's my first time at TPI Aspen. Thanks for the invitation, Scott, and nice to see you all. I should start with an proviso, and that is that I'm speaking as myself and not as the chair of the Quello Center or as the chief economist of the Federal Communications Commission. I also should sort of mention that before I started at the Federal Communications Commission, I was the lead in a large NTIA grant to Michigan State University and an internet service provider to upgrade Michigan's middle mile infrastructure. The project is, I had to recuse myself from the project. It's completed by now, but certainly it was a major experience in being part of the project. So this may cloud my take on some of the questions we ask. I also want to start by saying we need to broaden the questions that we ask here, right? I mean, to give a good answer to your question, to which my answer is actually yes, with a couple of nuances and provisos, probably. We need to answer really three interrelated questions. One is, under which conditions does competition work in infrastructure markets, which are sort of very unique markets in many ways. They have a highly spatial structure, they have various cost conditions, they have heterogeneous demand conditions. Often, I think that our traditional theories of competition that come from I/O that are highly abstract and stylized and very powerful at an analytical level, they do not capture the nature of entrepreneurship that we see in those local markets. So I'm suggesting that we should extend our theories of competition with sort of theories of entrepreneurship and in ideas that come out of strategic management, where they're much more closely debated. Secondly, once we answer the first question, right, we have to ask a related question: how well does competition achieve outcomes that we envision for those infrastructure industries? And they're typically a mix of efficiency goals and equity goals. And both are legitimate in their own ways, but economists have historically had more to say about efficiency than about equity. And thirdly, the third question that we need to ask is, if we feel that markets and entrepreneurship and competition are deficient or fail completely, what's the best response that policy can make to those? And my answer to that third question is the current sort of plethora of different approaches is probably not the best answer to the problem that we're facing. But let me come back to the first one, and then in the interest of time, hand it on to the other panelists. Fixed wireless and satellite have clearly been competitors in that space, right? I mean, they have exerted competitive pressures. They have driven new types of innovations into those markets. They're probably not completely equal substitutes for other types of broadband services that we have, right? I mean, so fixed wireless definitely is a very, very strong competitor to other types of fixed services and mobile services. And in fact, fixed wireless is the fastest growing area, and interestingly, T-Mobile has now the largest footprint of any carrier that provides fixed service in the United States, covering almost 2/3 of the market. Satellite is in a slightly different camp, right? It is a substitute, but it is more limited for some areas, and I think we can go into those. I'll leave it at this for now and look forward to our discussion.
I went back to 2010 and looked at this panel from TPI Aspen.
Excellent.
First minute, Scott, you explain that you just gave yourself a haircut and
Oh,
forgot to
God.
put on the guard. And so I guess you were explaining why you had a wacky haircut.
I had a strip of head on the back.
But I thought it'd be helpful to sort of go back to the time capsule and see how were people talking about broadband competition in 2010, and what were people foreseeing and not foreseeing, and it was really how much are the telcos going to upgrade from DSL to fiber, what's going to happen with DOCSIS 3.0 upgrades, and then there was a little bit of discussion, and this was also the same year that the National Broadband Plan came out, and so there was discussion about what role would the wireless players ultimately play in the sort of home broadband market. But I would guess that if you took a survey of everyone in the room there, the panelists, and said in 2024, what's the median number of choices that Americans are going to have for home broadband providers, I think people would say maybe 2. It seemed like that was about right. And today, I think the number is probably 3 or 4, something like that, for some of the reasons that have already been mentioned. So certainly it's made a huge impact because of some of these technologies, but also obviously the upgrades that have been made by companies like mine and telcos and so forth. I'll give you one bit of more anecdata. I live in a rural area on a farm. We moved out there in 2019, so before COVID, but the experience that I've had with the broadband experience living out there, I think really illustrates the impact that these technologies have had. So just to tell you, started out in 2019, the only option available was what I call a mom and pop WISP, right? So relatively small company, not great service. We were talking maybe about 8.2 on a good day, but just enough to survive, enough for us to actually buy the house, which, had to, really think about that. But then a year or so later, a 5G home product came out. It was like, had this like pink modem or something. Anyway, but that showed up. And then maybe a year and a half after that, I got SpaceX or Starlink, right? So LEO showed up. And so even in the course of 5 years that we've lived out there, we are starting to see competition in rural areas that in 2019 had very, very limited, broadband options. And for what it's worth, the definition of broadband at the time in 2019, there was no broadband. So, I think it's worth pointing out, I know we're going to talk about USF programs in a little bit, but these technologies have had an enormous impact, particularly in rural areas, in, I think, doing something that we probably didn't imagine in 2010, is that you could have competition, for instance, in areas that we always kind of had thought, hey, we're going to have to subsidize them, and then they're just going to be monopolies forever.
So I would just add something, and in full disclosure, like Johannes was saying, I have received 2 of these from SpaceLink over the last 2 years. So, full disclosure. Oh, it's this really cool luggage tag. But in just the last 2 years, the change in deployment by, so I'm going to use the word Starlink, but I should use low Earth orbit satellites, really. It's just that Starlink is the one that's already doing it. The image of their availability a year and a half ago, you could see vast areas that weren't covered. And I just looked up where they're available, not even on wait lists, and a majority of the country's covered. I mean, that's a huge change in availability. I think it's a huge change for unserved areas, underserved areas. And the fact that the FCC very much wishes to ignore that fact is stunning.
So, but just before you go, Will, because I think you'll have the part of the answer to this. So there's one question so far in Slido, and which says, we assume competition, but there's only one choice of broadband providers. Why do people still think that? I mean, is it because that when people look at the different options, there really is only one that works?
It's not for lack of advertising. I'll chime in on the first question, although maybe I shouldn't. The FCC's chief economist knows our stats, my company's stats, better than I do. And we've got the Comcast guy saying he was a T-Mobile customer. So maybe I should just, I don't know about the SpaceX thing. So as to competition, right, the fixed wireless growth and really birth as a major broadband competitor is only like 2.5 years in the making. So I go back to 2022. When we launched commercially, Verizon is there right behind us, and AT&T has a pretty robust fixed wireless offering today. And if you look over the last 10 quarters in the in-home broadband industry, there have been about 8.6 million new subscribers. That's been the growth of the industry. 8.7 million of those were fixed wireless. In other words, ex-fixed wireless, the in-home broadband industry has contracted by 100,000 subscribers in that time. It shows you how important fixed wireless has been to the in-home broadband industry in the US. And I think, Scott, I'm the only non-PhD economist on this panel, so I'll give you the everyman, common man color on this. My wife is from Tennessee. They're in Spectrum Charter territory, and when I go visit them, I see these really cute commercials that make fun of T-Mobile. I think they say something like, "Don't trust your mobile phone company with your in-home broadband," and I think they're really funny, and I think they're really encouraging as well, because when you have, and I think maybe your company, Jay, has a few of those commercials too. But what they show is that that's like real evidence, right, of fixed wireless impact on the in-home broadband industry, and it shows that we're making a real impact. I'd say two caveats, and I think we almost all agree on this, but two caveats, and these are important to our ability to continue to compete in in-home broadband. And the first is that we are very limited in capacity. That's real. And that's primarily a spectrum issue, but it's also a bit of an infrastructure issue. We can get into some of the math on that. And secondly, as my company at least has been in this market now for a couple of years, what we've noticed is not all broadband is broadband, or rather not all use cases are the same. So there are some customers for whom fiber and its various advantages is the name of the game. They won't consider us. There is a good portion of the market that is very interested in what we have to offer, and I could run through the commercial of the simplicity and the value, and you can look at ARPU and say that we offer some discount, but it's not a monolithic market. And so I think your original question about competition and substitutability is actually kind of complicated. It's not clear.
So sorry, go ahead. I wanted to come back to the first question that it's not going. I can't see it on the screen anymore. About the assumption that there is competition. It leads to that second point that I mentioned, right? I mean, it's necessary to really have a very sort of keen view as to where competition works and then where its limitations are and its deficiencies are. And there's a gradient between markets, right? I mean, there is still some large regions of the country, rural markets, but you can also look at other demographics like lower income populations and so forth, right? Where there's only perhaps one competitor, or maybe even no competitor. Now, it all hinges on whether we count satellite as a feasible competitor, which I tend to do, although the price, of course, of satellite service and the fixed cost of getting it started are prohibitive for many customers. In that sense, it's not an effective competitor. But we have to recognize that competition has not worked equally well across all different areas of the United States. And but the good news is this. I mean, since 2022, we have more granular data available that are sort of more accurate than the previous 477 data. And what we see is that there's actually improvements in all dimensions, right? I mean, if you look at the number of competitors as your indicator, you see that the number of areas where there's no competitor, only one, is decreasing very rapidly, that the number of places where there's now 3 or 4 is increasing very rapidly. The places that have higher quality service, the numbers are increasing. if you look at different socio-demographic variables, income or ethnicity and so forth, you also see improvements. But it doesn't mean that the problem has gone away, right? There's some areas, some populations for which competition is not sufficiently effective to really solve the equity problems that we envision when it comes to infrastructure services.
Yeah, Michelle.
So I totally plagiarize Scott and Greg Roston all the time, but I'm trying to be honest, because I learned this.
Plagiarize you, so it's
It's a loop. They brought up the case of Nebraska on the BEAD programming and how much, so they did a reverse auction, which is a good thing, but again, we're focusing on fiber and things like that. And so according to this email exchange, the winners, the cost for the winners ended up being about $20,000 per household. And Scott gave a great snarky remark that would pay for each household to get a Starlink terminal, which is $499, and now apparently on sale for $299 for only a month, and pay for 12 and a half years of monthly service. So when we're talking about equity, how many billions of dollars have we been spending on these schemes, I would say, these government schemes that claim they're going to improve equity and pricing. And in the more than 2 years it has taken to even kind of set up one of these schemes, we have private companies based on private incentives who've actually achieved what I say achieved the goals that the government is claiming they're trying to achieve. And I agree with the idea that maybe a $455 upfront cost makes this prohibitive. And I'm not saying everyone should get LEO, but in certain areas that might be your only option. But then it would make much more sense for the government, instead of using these billions of dollars and all these convoluted rules, would be just to subsidize the household directly. And I think that would be a much more efficient resolvement of the problem.
So I know we're going to be talking about USF, and I'm really looking forward to that portion, but I wanted to say a couple things, both taking off of y'all's comments and semi-addressing that first question, which is now maybe not even on there. First of all, that is just factually not true anymore, that the vast majority only have one. Whoever anonymous is, if you want to ask me afterwards, I will walk you through all the data with the new data and everything. I agree with everything you said. I've found the same things. But there's been, but kind of related to that, there's been this constant, the entire time I've been working in this area, effort to narrow the definition of broadband. And it's like you narrow the definition, and then you find there's no competition. And so sometimes that's what's also going on. And so we see it in terms of speed. So people want to just sort of assume away a lot of the competition that exists. We see it in terms of people want to say there's only one valid technology, right? Nothing else counts. We're also seeing this sort of related effort of a real push to, I call it like homogenizing all the offers. So there's only one way you can sell broadband, and you can package broadband, and ISP shouldn't have the ability to maybe contract with their customers in certain ways and so forth. And so we're seeing this like push to have folks in Washington and maybe in the States say, hey, this is what broadband is, and then sort of going back and saying there's competition. And you sort of stole my thunder on the commercials. Consumers don't believe this, right? Not only by their behavior, but they watch the Super Bowl. If you watch the Super Bowl in 2023, what you saw is your company saying things about my company, and my company saying things about your company. And then I think the next year, Verizon, AT&T got in on it, and everybody's competing for the home market. And what's completely left out of a lot of these definitions about broadband, whether it's the speed definition and so forth, is trade-offs, right? And price, right? So consumers are very comfortable with the idea of, hey, maybe T-Mobile's going to charge me less, and I'm going to get a different product, or I'm going to pay more for this other product. And that is just completely out of the conversation by and large. I will say, and then I'll finish, everything I said there is really related to competition and how we understand competition, which I think is really vibrant. That's a slightly different thing than that practical question of what should the government subsidize. And so I do think we need to distinguish those a little bit.
Right, and before we go on to that policy question, there are a lot of questions sort of inherently coming up about market definition here, right? Like somebody asks if anybody here has ever used the non-LEO satellite broadband, and we all know, those of us who have used it, sometimes it was good, sometimes it was awful. You could never game on it, right, because of the inherent latency. So that was sort of something in a different market. But then there are there are different geographic markets too. Now the FCC is sort of, I think, required to come to a conclusion on whether there is sufficient broadband competition or whatever the rule is, but that doesn't kind of make any sense. How should the FCC try to think about competition when there's not just one answer?
I think you don't assume, real quick, you don't assume that we're somehow at the end of history here. You look at the trend over time. So just to throw out a stat, I looked at in 2010 I used today's definition, 100/20 megabits per second, and I said, what did competition look like in 2010? Again, using the much more crummy 477 data, but 98% of the country did not even have access to 100/20. 0% of the country had any choice, 2 or more, right? This is not including LEOs, by the way. In 2023, that was just over 60%, okay? And many of those folks had 3 or 4 options. So that's the trend, and if you go and look and try to take what cable said they're gonna do in terms of upgrades and expansion, the telcos, the fixed wireless guys, you start to add all that in and project, and plus the BEAD programs, you're gonna have much more competition even going forward. There's no reason to believe that's gonna stop this year.
I'll take a stab at this one. And remember, I'm speaking for myself, okay, not for the Federal Communications Commission. So the problem that you mentioned, right, that sort of the definition of what we consider broadband influences what competitive landscape we see is an issue, right? But I think there's a more generic problem at the heart of this, and that is that technology, network industries evolve in multiple ways. I mean, you have fantastic advances, but those advances are not necessarily available throughout the whole network infrastructure immediately, right? So there is sort of some differentiation between the types of services, the types of technology that is available. And the basic fundamental problem that we have to ask as a society is, what types of services, what level of quality do we consider is important, so important and so fundamental that everybody should have access to it, right? And then what level of differentiation are we willing to allow? And I don't think we have a very rational way to approach those things, right? I mean, we have sort of ad hoc-ish steps and increments that we choose going forward. From an economic perspective, right, I mean, there's really no magic threshold that sort of identifies markets that yield 120 download and upload speeds from others. I mean, they are in competition with each other, right? But the competition is not an on or off. It's like the first question in the AI panel, right? I mean, the question of whether AI is good or bad is perfectly useless. The question whether competition exists or doesn't is perfectly useless also. It's a question of intensity. Competition can be weak or it can be intense. Substitutability can be weak or it can be intense. And so I think a better approach would be to identify more clearly how intense is competition that we see, right? Is it sufficiently intense to achieve the outcomes that we want? And again, we haven't talked about prices. One reason, for example, why a lot of people are excluded from currently subscribing to services, broadband services, is the price of broadband services, right? So we have an affordability issue. And even in areas where higher quality services are available, they're sometimes priced at levels where a lot of the population think that they're sort of too expensive for their needs. There's a whole other sort of set of issues related to affordability. But these are indications that sort of a plain sort of focus on the number of providers, for example, or whether competition exists or doesn't exist, right, misses those nuances. And we have to dig deeper into what are the factors that influence these outcomes.
Right. So let's pull a few of those things together. So with more competition up to some point, you would expect to see lower prices. Somebody asked about that. Do we see any evidence of that? And then the other question is with the affordable connectivity program. Does it, are we spending too much on infrastructure relative to helping low-income people? And sorry, Michelle, I think you're about to say something. I interrupted you.
Yeah, no, so I always react best to hearing other people's thoughts. So one thing that I would mention is what's very rarely discussed is actual usage needs. Okay, and I also stole this from Scott and Greg. This was spring of 2023, I actually went through every internet application and found out what their min requirements were. So this may be slightly off, but the highest min requirement for download speed was 15 megabits per second. That was Netflix if you were using it on a 4K ultra high definition television. The highest minimum upload speed I found was for Twitch live video game streaming, and that was 6 megabits per second up. And gaming apps said that the max latency that they could accept was 150 milliseconds. So, and that's of course one application by one person. So I can certainly see if you have more people in your household, if you're trying to run more things at the same time, then you're going to want more. But affordability should also be a sense that, well, if I am just one person and I don't need 100 megabits per second, is that really the only option I have? Secondly, almost all major internet service providers have always had a low-income plan, and those plans have been quite low. Like some were $10 a month, some were 15, some were 17. A lot of these, I think, miraculously bumped up when the ACP started offering $30 a month to cover individuals. But it is not the case that everyone is paying the face value price. Also, we have to realize pricing is usually national. Now, there could be specials for certain regions, but much of the pricing is national. So it's not like, well, I think that's one thing to point out, and then the other thing is that there are low price offerings available that people will often forego, even if they're low income, because they prefer other things.
Right, it's not just price. So what does this mean for the way we've the way we've addressed universal service issues? Universal service came from the era when there was one company and they cross-subsidized high-cost areas by charging urban areas more and businesses more, and that was sort of the rationale of how we ended up with the Universal Service Fund, which there was more competition, and none of it's really changed. Assuming that we still believe in that societal goal of making sure that everybody everywhere has some access to some minimum level, what should we be doing differently?
Well, good companies listen to their customers, and I think policymakers in this space should listen to their constituents. And here, whether it's the fixed wireless story or we're talking a lot about LeoSats, you've seen a big change, not only in technology, but what folks have been demanding. I think we're almost all in agreement on this one, that at a very high level, the approach of the government kind of stimulating the supply side by funding infrastructure directly raises a lot of thorny issues. Like, for example, the government then has to determine, well, what is the right level of broadband or quality of broadband that everyone should have? Should it be so-called future-proof fiber, or should we be more efficient and actually meet what people need today? And my numbers are not that different than yours, Michelle. So the radical idea would be, maybe to the extent consumers need it, you provide resources so they can go purchase broadband, and that might stimulate providers to go build. So it's a really good idea that the government has chosen not to do. They continue to fund infrastructure. Our position is, if you're going to stimulate the supply instead of the demand, then you ought to do it in a very efficient, targeted way. And the kind of core belief there is I work for a major telecom company, and we are in the business of trying to figure out what our customers want to use our network for, but we don't know for sure 5 years from now or 10 years from now what the new use case will be, and therefore what kind of network we have to plan 10 years from now for today. And so I guess the core insight is for the government, do you all have a crystal ball that is better than ours? And my guess would be that they don't. And so again, that kind of brings us back to, I think we've all mentioned it, a kind of demand side stimulus, and that sounds kind of like ACP. One other interesting thing that people kind of overlook on ACP, there was a direct infrastructure piece to ACP. There was this provision, which I don't think any ISP in the country actually took advantage of, which upped the subsidy from the standard $30 to $75 for extremely high-cost locations. To my knowledge, maybe someone in the crowd knows better than I do, but I have not heard of an ISP taking advantage of that. The notion there is, well, there are places where the infrastructure necessary to provide service are more expensive, typically rural areas, and so you kind of have to increase the amount of subsidy to stimulate and to incent. Say it again? Tribe.
Yeah, there was a lot of tribe.
There was a tribal broadband at $75, and then there's.
Entitled to the 75 as well as the high cost, and for tribal ISPs it was significant.
Yeah.
Right, but they didn't have to do anything. It was declared at $75. Right.
And then I believe there was a separate provision that I was referring to for ISPs in non-tribal areas. And again, maybe you know, Harold, but to my knowledge, nobody took advantage of that. Anyway, interesting infrastructure. It's an idea, a kernel of an idea for a demand side that could actually stimulate private sector infrastructure.
I'll offer some conceptual ideas as we're thinking about the traditional USF. What the government's doing is it's buying a network. It's collaborating with the private sector to buy a network. If you think about the LEOs and the cost structure, in a sense, what you can start to imagine doing is you're actually you don't have to buy the constellation if you're the government. You're just buying some capacity there, or you're buying some seats, right, for unserved folks. And so I think that does open up some interesting ways we can start thinking about the high cost portion of USF, both officially the USF and maybe more generally. The most obvious is, Michelle already brought it up, there's going to be places where you can do this at lower cost. You can connect folks at lower cost, and that's kind of the obvious one, and I think it helps on the distribution side. There's this whole conversation about unsustainability with the USF fund, and one of the things we want to make sure is that we don't just blow it out. So I think that helps on the distribution side most obviously, but I think there's other things.
So that was an implicit answer to Rob's question, basically,
Okay.
just should we blow up the
I can't read
high-cost
and
fund?
listen, so I'm not even
Okay.
But,
Sorry, didn't mean to.
I mean, another one is time, right? Has anyone gone and asked rural people who haven't had broadband, hey, let me give you a choice here. Next week, we can get you set up with your LEO, and we'll get you going, or 4 years from now, hopefully, you'll get your fiber connection. So,
And in option A, you get to keep $10,000 or $20,000.
yeah. So I'm not even getting to that, right? Because third party's paying for that, the government's paying.
Right.
But just go and ask someone how much do they value that time, and I think we should at least incorporate that element much more. Getting a little bit more. I already mentioned it. SpaceX is already there. Kuiper is planning on doing something. Maybe others will do something. I just heard something about Canada maybe wanting to build a constellation. It is now conceivable that you could have.
Everybody laughs when you say Canada's going to do something.
But fine, just leave the two.
Yeah.
You can have rural competition, right? This is like a big deal. It should be a big deal. And by the way, a lot of those areas may have some other type of terrestrial connection already. So that's exciting. Two more. I think we can actually leverage this competition that exists from like the LEOs existing when we look at, for instance, the legacy high cost, okay? So there's always been kind of this holdout problem where, look, we're the legacy rate of return folks, they say, hey, if you cut us off, like then you'll just be stranded. Well, guess what? There's now an outside option. And I think we should start getting more creative with how that outside option can help us competitively as we try to make these more efficient. And then lastly, as we think about things like BEAD going forward, there's kind of this looming OpEx risk that you're going to have USF blow up as all these funds, or all, you know, the BEAD, for instance, builds these, and then they say, hey, we need OpEx. And I think many people are fully expecting that's going to happen, that they're going to ask for USF. And we should at least stop for a second and say, hey, even if we fund those fiber things, we shouldn't just completely accept that, yeah, they need OpEx. We should recognize we have some outside options. Maybe we should test that. Maybe we should say, hey, let's really see, knowing that we have the ability to, you know, if that network struggles, then, you know, people can stay connected. They're not just going to be stranded. So I think there's lots of conceptual ways we can start to think about USF. I know I've like pissed off like several different interest groups right there.
Possibly your own company.
No, I don't think so. Because I think it is important that we, you know, make sure we manage everything I said there was really on that distribution side.
And I mean, also generally from the questions and people who are skeptical about whether there's sufficient competition, and from our history of USF, we've focused so heavily on subsidizing the supply and not demand. That most of the questions seem to be about, well, how can people, why don't more people have it? Not really anymore, is it not there? Is it possible to change to a more, I don't know whether you want to call it a voucher-based system or a system that emphasizes more low-income support, or is high cost just captured forever?
It's a really, you raised a couple of really good points. I mean, for one, first of all, let me go back a couple of steps here. When we talk about competition, right, I mean, we really don't have a good counterfactual because we had over the past decades, we had multiple programs in place, right, that coexisted, right? So what we see is not the pure effects of competition, but there's other programs that have contributed too. Secondly, I didn't want to create the impression that upgrading what we perceive or we consider is a minimum level of connectivity is wrong. It's actually necessary as connectivity becomes increasingly critical for our society. And in fact, unless you have certain minimum level of connectivity, you are excluded increasingly. I mean, I live in Michigan, and I'm not in Washington, D.C., and in our Upper Peninsula, a very rural area, we see incredible forms of exclusion because many healthcare providers now are moving to online telehealth provision. And for them, it's an efficiency improving innovation, right? But for people who don't have the right level of connectivity or the level of sort of a stable connectivity that they would need, it's a new form of exclusion. They cannot even make an appointment with a doctor anymore, right? And so I think there's really serious issues that we need to consider. And but coming back to different funding models, right? I mean, I don't think we can understand universal service funding in this country without going to the political economy of those programs, right? And once you have a program in place, you create veto players who are opposed to changing the program. So now we have, with the best of all intentions, we have an accumulation of programs that really don't work well with each other frequently, but they send conflicting incentives to providers. I deal a lot with small entrepreneurs who have a hard time navigating the complicated conditions, right? So what we would need is a serious simplification. I don't think the need for supply-side programs will completely disappear, right? There's good reasons for it. One of them, for example, is the resilience of network structure. So one policy that would simply rely on satellite connectivity for rural areas probably has a resilience weakness that we haven't really explored and don't fully understand yet. On the other hand, demand-side programs just have lots of appealing things. I mean, as you said, I mean, if I have a voucher, I have a subsidy that I can use to buy broadband, I can easily switch from one to the other. We would overcome a time inconsistency issue. And I know plenty of people who actually subscribe to satellite connectivity because it was the only option. But once fiber was available, they would happily move to fiber because of the better latency of service and so forth that they had available on fiber. And I think a model that empowers users to use their decisions to drive what we see in terms of investment would actually be desirable and has much to commend to it. The only problem that I see is this, that markets in infrastructure sectors don't often not coordinate as well as we wish, right? You have an aggregation problem. As a provider, you don't necessarily know ahead of time what's my take rate, right? And that is one of the things that will influence investment decisions. So clearly demand-driven investment course forward is probably less workable than we think right now.
So just from questions, I think there is clarification we want to make. Yes, we've been talking about satellite offering coverage for many, many years, but historically we've had geostationary satellites, and and they're very far away from the Earth, and that creates this latency issue. What we're calling LEO is low Earth orbit or non-stationary satellites. They're much, much closer, and therefore are able to resolve the latency issue. So that's why, to me, I mean, it really was a game changer when I learned about this. And that's why this is not the same discussion that we were having about satellites 20 years ago. I forgot what my other point was. But.
I mean, when I saw your question, Scott, that you posed here about infrastructure subsidies versus, I think you said, a low-income voucher, to form my opinion, I built a model. I think we have to do that. Like, I don't actually think it's one or the other necessarily. So if we're talking about rural areas, and so let's look at the net present value of kind of those different approaches. And it's pretty clear to me that there are definitely areas where the NPV makes sense to build out that fiber, okay? But then there's certainly, it's very also clear, there's a place that it flips over, and it probably makes a lot more sense for the government to maybe be doing something like, buying down the price, if you want to put that there, not buying the network, buying down the price. And so I'd say it's not an either or, but I would hope that people are exploring it in a rational way like that. And look, the states with BEAD, are supposed to be figuring out, hey, how far do we build, a wireline network, and then we go maybe fixed wireless or LEOs elsewhere. And so I would hope that we can sort of rationally look at that, because there's very clearly, in my opinion, and based on the model I was looking at, a place where that makes sense. And then also I would say, though, you do recognize that there's that time effect.
Well,
how long are we going to have to wait?
Right, and deciding where that line is depends a lot on what we think people's time preferences are, right? And so if people think broadband is a human right, then maybe you don't want to make them wait 5 years for something. But if fiber is by objective measures better, then that's going to push out the line a little more to where you want
the time preference, but also, at least right now, there's obviously a speed difference, a capability difference between a fiber connection and maybe fixed wireless or a LEO. And a very interesting idea would be for the FCC to go out there and actually ask real people, here, use this product for a month, here, use this one for a month, and elicit their actual willingness to pay. I don't think that's actually a crazy thing when we're gonna be spending billions and billions of dollars allocating. I mean, a private organization just ran this 3-year study on UBI, right? Giving people $1,000, this stuff's doable. What I described actually sounds easier than that.
Jeff and I did one for, a lot less than the cost of a connection.
But again, these models and what's rational really does depend on those things like time preference. And I know you've written a paper in the past about, I think, willingness to pay for different speeds. We need some updated information on some of those things.
Okay, I think we better wrap up, although I'd really love to keep going for a long time. So we're late, we're running late. So thank you all very much. I think it's a really interesting panel. There are a lot of good questions still up there. Again, we have them archived, so we'll hopefully make them available. So thank you very much. And let's see. Now we will take another 10-minute break and then come back. And you want to hear from, we have actual telecom regulators who will be speaking next. We have enough, I think, to make an entirely new commission of international regulators. So be back in 10 minutes.